So what is a rifle cartridge? Well, first of all, let's start out with the term cartridge. This is a complete cartridge, which is made up of 4 components. Your propellant, in other words, your gunpowder. A case made to contain your propellant. A primer, which is simply a mechanism including a chemical priming compound that will ignite a flame to ignite the propellant. And then, of course, your projectile, which is a bullet. The case is made in a cylindrical fashion, forming basically a column. At the bottom is where your ignition starts from your detonation device, your primer, igniting the propellant, and then discharging or pushing this projectile down your rifled bore. I'll get to the rifle part in a second. Basically, a rifle cartridge is a controlled explosive device. And what's happening when you pull the trigger is a controlled explosion is happening. Of course, your detonation happens down here, which sends the spark or flame to detonate your propellant, which causes the explosion in this cylindrical container. And this hole at the end is your weakest link. This bullet is seated on there just strong enough or tight enough that it won't move, but loose enough and smooth enough at the end that it will obviously be discharged or pushed easily. And so the weakest link, is where your explosion will happen, and we'll push this bullet down the bore of the barrel. Now on to the rifle part of the term rifle cartridge. I know this is obvious, but there's 3 essential parts of a rifle. The barrel, which is made up of a chamber and a muzzle. The lock. Now, this is a bolt-action rifle, but you don't actually need a bolt action. You don't even actually need any action. In fact, you don't even need a receiver, which is what this part is. This receiver goes up against the barrel. All you really need is a lock. Even though this bolt-action receiver is a lock, as long as you have something back here to lock in the cartridge in place so that when you pull the trigger and it fires, it can't go backward. As long as it's locked into place and it can't go in reverse, then you're good. So a single shot, for instance, just has a back part of the gun that simply locks up against the barrel, and that's good enough. But most guns have a receiver area, and the receiver is just simply an area where the next follow-up cartridge will be received in order to be pushed into the chamber for the next round. And how this is done is by its action. And that, once again, could be a bolt action, like this. It could be a lever action, or a pump action, or something like that. But the action is just simply how it recycles the round for the follow-up shot. And the receiver is what houses that action. But all you actually need is a lock, something to keep the bullet from going backward, a barrel, which once again is mainly consistent of a chamber and a muzzle, and then you simply need a way to strike the primer. And usually that is done by a trigger assembly, which simply, by pulling this trigger blade, you're disengaging the sear, which then lets the spring push forward, either a striker or a hammer, depending on the type of action or trigger. And therefore, the firing pin will engage the primer. Once again, starting this reaction, the primer mechanism, moves, causes friction with the priming chemical compound, which causes a spark or a flame, which ignites the propellant, which will then send that projectile down the path of least resistance, which is out the side of the container or the case where the bullet is seated and down the muzzle. You don't actually need a stock, although it's much more feasible, wieldable, and safer to have a stock. And you actually don't even need sights, but why would you not want sights? You want to be able to aim and shoot where you're trying to aim. But all you really need is the barrel, the lockup, and a way to strike the primer like a trigger assembly. Of course, after the shot is made, all components of the cartridge are expendable, are single-time use other than the case, or the container that was used to hold the propellant, of course, can be reloaded, reused. The primer is spent. It needs to be deprimed. The bullet, of course, the projectile has been shot and is not coming back. And then, of course, all the propellant, the powder, has burned up. So only the case is reloadable. Of course, the case is made up of several dimensions. You have your overall length of the case. You have your neck where the bullet is seated. You have a shoulder with an angle that will go from the neck of your case, which is the same dimensions as the diameter of the bullet, and then goes at a different angle depending on your cartridge to the outside wall of the overall case. And then it will go down here to your head, and of course your head has a rim on it, which is simply made to extract the spent case once it's been fired from the chamber. Almost all cases are made of brass, which is a malleable metal, and it's easily manipulated. Therefore, when this controlled explosion happens, if the tolerances of the chamber around the case are not tight, this brass will expand, possibly have a laceration or a cut, possibly blow up, and very likely will stretch a little bit. If you reload, you'll probably have to resize and recut your brass to the right length. But the chamber, being with tight tolerances around, keep your brass from just totally exploding. Because once again, it's not suitable or strong enough to have the controlled explosion happen without it blowing up. But because of the walls around the case that are called that chamber, it'll keep this case basically the same shape. Now this is a 30-06 case, and these are all 30 caliber bullets. What caliber denotes is the width of the bullet at its largest point. So not up here at the tip, not at the ogive or ogive. Definitely if it has a boat tail like some of these, not back here, but at its widest point, and that diameter is called the caliber. Sometimes caliber and cartridge get confused, but this is a complete cartridge, a 30-06 cartridge. 30-06 happens to be 30 caliber. Of course, any one of these bullets can be shot from this 30-06. This is 125 grain, 150 grain, 180 grain, and 190 grain bullet. I do want to go back to the barrel for a minute. I forgot to talk about where the term rifle comes from. But In the bore of your barrel, there's grooves spiraled in place by either cutting or pressing, and they form a spiral groove and a land which causes the bullet to spin. Therefore, when the bullet exits your muzzle, which is just the end of the bore, it is spinning just like a football that would be spiraling. Of course, this helps to stabilize it. Some barrels and bores are smooth bore, like a shotgun. Therefore, there's no rifling required and no twist required. So the last part of the equation when it comes to a rifle cartridge is a cartridge made up of the 4 components that we talked about, which will be a controlled explosion leading in this projectile going down a rifled bore. And therefore, it will be spinning when it exits the muzzle, and it will be stable. Now, getting back to these bullets, they're all 30 caliber, which is the diameter of its width, which is 0.308 inches or 7.62 millimeters. That's also, of course, the same diameter of your bore. So if you want to have different weights, say this 125 grain bullet compared to this 190 grain bullet, the only way to have a heavier bullet is to extend the length of the bullet, because it can't not be 30 caliber shooting in a 30 caliber bore. One note about the case: what makes this 30-06 a 30-06 is not the bullet. It's not the propellant, not the powder I showed you earlier, and it's not the primer. The primer can be interchanged. I mean, there are recommended primers, like a large rifle primer, but you could shoot a small rifle primer. And you could shoot a Magnum rifle primer, but it's recommended and only needed a large rifle primer. There's also many different brands of primers, some match grade and some just for simple hunting use. But the primer is exchangeable. The bullet is exchangeable. The propellant is exchangeable. It can be whatever you want to use. And of course the cases are exchangeable too. There's different brands that manufacture different cases, but all the cases are going to look the same. They're not going to be different, because the thing that makes a 30-06 is the case. Here's a 308 case next to a 30-06 case. What makes these different? Technically, they take the same primer, or you could use the same propellant. You might not want to, but you could. They take exactly the same caliber bullet, so any of these bullets would work. They actually have the same head diameter as well. What makes a 308 a 308? What makes a 30-06 a 30-06 is the case. So if you say, well, I'm a big fan of the 30-06, but I can't stand the 308, I don't know why you'd say that, but if you did say it, you must like this case better than this case, because that's where the difference comes from. That's what makes each individual cartridge unique, is the case. Now, despite what you see on the cartoon movie Roger Rabbit, the only thing exiting this muzzle, which once again is the end of the bore, is the projectile, not the case. All the propellant, the powder, is burned up within the muzzle. Some unburnt powder, and of course the flames will come out, but it's all gone. The primer, of course, is still, if I can get that to focus, primer is still in the case. It's now useless, needs to be thrown away. And of course the case is now, the container, the case is empty, could be reloaded. At this point, as you've pulled the trigger and The controlled explosions happened. All that's now in play is that projectile. At this point, everything just comes down to just a very few questions. Number one, you have to ask yourself, is the bullet stable? And you should already know whether if it is or not. So every barrel has a twist rate. That means how many inches going down the barrel at a spiraling effect will it take the bullet to make a complete 360. So if your twist rate is 1 in 12, that means that every 12 inches, the spiraling, the rifling in the muzzle bore, in the barrel bore, has caused that bullet to spin one full time. If it's a 1 in 7, which sounds like a lower number, it's actually much faster. That means it's spun around 360 in only 7 inches. So this is a 190 grain bullet, and it will need to have a little bit more stabilizing factors applied to it to get it to spiral in the air like a football and stabilize than say would a 125 grain bullet. So you just have to know ahead of time, is the twist rate in my barrel, in the bore, fast enough to stabilize the projectile I'm shooting? So the first question is, you should know, is that bullet stable? And you should already know that before you shoot it. The second question that you have to know, and probably the most important, is as soon as the bullet leaves this point right here, the muzzle, the end of the bore inside this barrel, how fast is that bullet going? If you want to know the velocity, the feet per second, that's what you got to know. How fast is it going? How many feet per second is it traveling? That will actually tell you how much energy the bullet has as well, just by a simple math equation. So if you want to know how many foot-pounds of energy this bullet is carrying, all you really need to know is how heavy it is, what's the weight, what's the mass, and how fast is it going at this exact point. So pretty much all of your numbers and metrics that you're looking for and trying to figure out will be determined by how fast that bullet is traveling at that exact point. And then from that point, you can figure out how slow is it going to lose speed, because obviously gravity takes an immediate effect. Also, just the density of the air, the altitude, wind, all that's going to have an effect on how quickly it slows down. I know that sounds like an oxymoron, but how quickly the bullet slows down, or how slow it slows down. And also how quickly or slow will it lose its energy. And this is determined by the next question you need to ask. What is its ballistic coefficient? I'm not going to get into this deep today on this video, but this really has to do with two things. The weight, I guess three things. The weight of this bullet, how aerodynamic it is, its shape, and then how fast it's going. Those things will give you its ballistic coefficient. And a bullet with a high ballistic coefficient is going to buck the wind better, and it's going to shed its energy and velocity a little slower. Of course, if you are hunting within 100 yards, it really doesn't mean anything. The ballistic coefficient is kind of a useless number. But if you're target shooting at, say, 1,500 yards, it means a lot. And you need to know that before you shoot it. So, questions you need to know. Is it stable? How fast is it traveling? what is its ballistic coefficient? And then the last question is, does the construction of this bullet line up with the application that I'm going to be using it for? Because all bullets are constructed differently. You have bullets that are strictly for long-range target shooting, in which expansion is not consistent, but it's simply made to be very aerodynamic, more than likely have a high ballistic coefficient, and be very consistent in how it shoots. And once it hits the target, nothing really means anything. If it disintegrates or if it blows into a million pieces, that really doesn't matter, as long as it hits the same spot again and again. Sometimes you have varmint rounds that are similar to that, and actually they're made more frangible or fragile, so that when they hit the varmint, they blow up within it, inside, causing many fragments, and drop it quickly. Because within varmint hunting, you're not hunting for meat. Usually you're hunting just as an eradication mission. And then your standard hunting bullet is made to mushroom. It's made to expand and actually be much bigger. The base will probably be the same, but this part will peel back and it'll be much wider than its caliber and cause as big of a hole as possible as it goes through the animal to cause as much blood loss as possible. But also, you don't want the bullet to fragment. You want it to stay together because you're looking to keep as much meat as possible, and you don't want meat damage. Now, of these 4 questions, you should already know all 4 before you pull the trigger. Definitely, is the bullet the right construction for the application I'm using it for? You should have looked up its ballistic coefficient, if you even care about that. Once again, if you're short-range hunting, you probably don't. You definitely should know if the bullet's stable, based on the twist rate of your barrel and the weight and design of your bullet. The 4th one you should know, but you may not know exactly, and that's what is the velocity. What's the speed of that bullet? Now, you can go by published numbers in a reloading manual or on the back of a box of ammunition, but you won't know specifically until you use a chronograph to measure it. But once again, the biggest thing, the other 3 are kind of givens you should already know, but the biggest thing is how fast is that bullet traveling. So, kind of to repeat myself, at this point, when that bullet leaves that muzzle, nothing else matters now except for how fast is that bullet traveling. So I guess my point here is, when you're trying to figure out what it is you're looking for in a rifle cartridge, understanding the basics, first of all, will be fundamental in helping you to understand what you're looking for, but also helps you know the difference. So let's say once this bullet has left this muzzle, let's say it's going, now this particular one's 190 grain. It's a little on the heavy side. Let's say it's going, 2,700 feet per second. Let's just say that. Do I know if it came out of a case, a 308 case or a 30-06 case? Based on that number, I don't actually know, but if you had to guess, you'd probably guess a 30-06. Because more than likely, if that same bullet was shot out of this case, it would be going a little slower, probably. Maybe, let's just say it's going 2,600 feet per second out of a 308 case. Which really gets back to the main difference in these cases, is just simple case capacity. The big difference between a 308 and a 30-06 is one holds more case capacity of powder. Does that mean anything? Depends what you're doing. So the 308 is more efficient, so it has less case capacity, less powder, yet it gets more out of what it's using. But your 30-06 has more potential, more performance that it can get when loaded to its max. So if you're strictly hunting and you want to shoot the heavier bullets, maybe at slightly longer, like say medium distances, maybe 300 yards, maybe the 30-06 is more ideal for that purpose because of its extra case capacity. If you're shooting white-tailed deer and most of your shots are 75 yards or closer, and you're going to be shooting, let's say, a 150 grain bullet, you might want the efficiency of a 308. So one other thing about the different cases that should be known, a big proponent of 308s will say they like the short action. Now you see the difference. We're talking like a ½ here. So a short action versus a standard or long action is about a ½ difference. Not much. That will obviously cut the length of your gun by a ½ or so. Therefore, your bolt manipulation on say, a bolt action rifle is going to be a ½ inch less, microscopic amount quicker. The gun, of course, will be a ½ inch shorter, and therefore a ½ inch less metal, a ½ inch less wood. It's going to be just a little bit lighter. And then usually when you've already decided you'd rather have a more efficient design and you're willing to give up a little bit of performance, maybe you're willing to give up a little bit more. So maybe you don't want the standard 24-inch barrel that the 30-06 requires or is more common to be used with. But knowing you've got less powder to burn anyway, you decided to go with a 22-inch barrel. Therefore, you've took another 2 inches of barrel of metal off the length and now the weight of your gun. So there can be definite advantages to the shorter, more compact case, or there can be definite advantages to the little bit bigger, higher performing case. It's all shooting the same bullet. Of course, it must be mentioned that when you put in the bullet into the chamber and it's now locked in place and it's fired, and that whole process we've already explained happens, there's an equal and opposite force that will always happen. And since we are locked back here and the case, the entire cartridge cannot go backward, everything is aimed and directed forward out the muzzle, of course, but there's always an opposite and equal reaction, and therefore recoil or kick. Your gun itself will jump back, and you'll feel that in your shoulder. So sometimes a person will want a smaller case for simply they want less powder to be shot because they know there's going to be less recoil. So someone might choose a 308 over a 30-06 for a little less recoil. Also, the heavier the bullet, the more recoil. The more energy is going this way, the more energy has got to come back this way. So some people might say, actually, instead of a 243, I'll take the same case, but go down to 24 caliber or 6 millimeter, and I'll shoot a much lighter bullet, like a 95 grain bullet or maybe a 85 grain bullet, and it's definitely going to kick less. So just think about these things when you're trying to figure out if a 7 mag is better than a 30-06, if a 6.8 Western is better than a 6.5 PRC. Just don't forget really how simplistic that a rifle cartridge really is. And hopefully you won't pick it based on nostalgia or your pride, but maybe if you're really looking at the capabilities and the potential of the cartridges, don't forget this really is a pretty simple process. Just think about that bullet coming out of the muzzle, and really, as long as it's stable, it's constructed properly, and you know it's BC, all that really matters is how fast that bullet is shooting. So that might help you when you're trying to figure out which rifle cartridges that you want to buy, or which rifle cartridges that you're looking for or you think are the best. Just think about that bullet after it's left the muzzle and how fast it's going, and that really should simplify it down. I like to nerd out about this stuff. I love thinking about rifles and rifle cartridges. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. It really helps the channel out a lot and pushes my videos to where they actually get seen and people watch them, and then hopefully more people like them, and before long I've got more subscribers. Just reached 180 subscribers. I'm hoping to continue to move that forward. But hopefully you've enjoyed it. I know this is, for some of you, very basic, but I figure a lot of people that maybe don't know a whole lot about rifle cartridges might tune into this video and might learn a little something. But anyway, until next time, have a great day and take care.